human rights is not some sort of buffet that you walk along and you say, oh, I'd like to pick this one and I'd like a little bit of this one. And when we work with victims and survivors from Egypt to Libya to China, victims of torture, victims of serious abuses, they care about their human rights. Their families care about their human rights. You go to a mother of a disappeared person anywhere in the world, and they want justice and accountability. They want somebody to be responsible for the abuses that took place. Those are human rights. I think women are very hard to stop. We covered 5 countries that you just named in the report. And what we found as a trend was that the digital public square, the digital online space, has become an incredibly important tool for the LGBT community. It's a place to gather, it's a place for solidarity, it's a place where you're able to exist previous to what we've documented, we thought safely. However, the digital space has become increasingly unsafe because what we have seen is that information that is put out is being used by governments and security forces in particular to actually entrap members of the LGBT community. So we have seen a pattern of, for example, security forces who will go in, they will extract photographs. In some of the worst instances that we saw, we actually documented security forces posing as dates on dating applications like Tinder and Grindr, that they would then engage in backwards and forwards and meetings with individuals, entrap them, and use that material to either arrest them, or in some instances we've also seen that their private information, their messages, which are extorted under sometimes violence and duress, can be used as court cases against them, and also they threaten them to share them with their families or share them publicly online, which has vast consequences for the LGBT community. We've seen very sad and tragic incidents where LGBT members of the community were outed. Their family members were then known, they were thrown out of home, some violence was committed against them, and in some of the worst instances you see that they're thrown in prison. In Egypt, there was one particularly horrific case of a transgender woman who was detained with men, and for over 1 year she was exposed to violence, including sexual violence, in her detention. And we've seen them just harvesting people's public information from Facebook, from other social media apps where people are living, like all of us. We have a digital footprint. We have little vignettes into our lives. Except for members of the LGBT community, those little vignettes of their lives, including what brings them joy, the people that they love, the people they spend time with, this is then weaponized against them and being used to arrest them, to bring them in for questioning. But it's not just the apps. It's also that we have documented that security forces and officials have just taken laptops, computers, but you can imagine handing over your phone. How much information is in your phone? And when the security forces are questioning you, pressuring you, and sometimes using violence to coerce you and give you the password under duress, then they have access to all your photos and they're able to construct a case. And not only are they using that to actually pursue and prosecute some members of the LGBT community, but as we were discussing before, it has been used just to out them, which has meant people losing their jobs or losing contact with their families. The governments through the region, and this includes the Lebanese authorities, have obligations under international human rights law to protect its citizens, including members of the LGBT community. And this isn't complicated. This is about ensuring that the anti-discrimination laws exist, and if they do exist, that they go as far to explicitly protect members of the LGBT community. Also, there needs to be assurances from the governments that their security forces stop partaking in these coercive and probably not in line with the due process that's required to get the evidence that they're using from the members of the LGBT community for these cases. One concrete step that we've taken is that we have been pushing governments to stop using these vague morality laws to be able to criminalise, essentially, same-sex relationships. Just taking these vague morality laws off the books, because they are incredibly harmful, would go a long way to protecting LGBT community in the region. So male guardianship has been a very damaging tool to women's rights, particularly freedom of movement. One of the things that we've documented across the region is that women need permission from their husbands, from their brothers, from their fathers primarily, but not only. If they're not there, it can be a second or third cousin. It's just a male relative who has to be able to sign off on, sometimes if they want a passport. Other times it's actually if they can travel, move, and then we're not talking about if they can leave the country. In some instances, it's if they can actually move within the country. We've even seen instances where women in the region have needed to provide proof, written proof of permission from their male guardian if they're at university and they want to go on a field trip, or if they actually even just want to leave the campus if they're studying there. It's not just about movement, and it's not just about can women drive a car either. It's really about all of the fundamental rights that women have, for example, when they get married. In the most extreme circumstances, we've seen these sort of damaging laws being used where women who were survivors of sexual violence, women who were raped, were forced to marry their abuser. That's one of the most egregious and abusive ways that these sort of male guardianship laws have violated women's rights. But on a day-to-day basis, you see that women are unable to leave domestic violence situations. They're often, even if they do go to the police, they're sent back to the family, or they can even be charged and arrested for leaving the marital home. We have cases that we have documented where their women are in prison because they fled domestic violence. In other instances, you see that where women have tried to leave or they're getting divorce, that they're not able to get custody of their children. They lose custody of their children. And other instances that women's rights, which are guaranteed under the convention. There's a convention on women's rights which protects women's rights and freedoms. These are consistently violated by things like, imagine going to court. You're trying to get a divorce, you lose custody of your children, you have no standing, and you have no property rights. It leaves a woman completely isolated, but it's not just about the legal consequences of it. There are many social consequences too. Women can then be banished and excluded from their families for going against the system. The whole system is set up in these countries to really repress women's rights, but there is a way out of it. It's legal reform. There's a strong and fierce women's rights movement in this region. I think Lebanon is a prime example of that. And we have seen that women's active human rights defenders are able to mobilise and prescribe They know what the solutions are. They know what the amendments to the laws are. And it's not just a matter of the voices that are coming from within these countries, but it's also about, do they have support, and is there adequate sort of pressure on the authorities and on the, maybe let's call them conservative elements of governments or legislators, that would encourage them to actually open up and make the legislative changes that are required. And so we've seen, for example, the women's rights movement and women's rights activists use various tools at the Human Rights Council, where countries' human rights records are up for discussion. It's called the Universal Periodic Review. And that is where women's rights activists have really mobilized to point out that what pieces of legislation are in violation, because all governments want to have good standing in the world. And if you're not getting women's rights right in your own domestic context, then you don't deserve that prominent international standing. So it's important. But it's not all doom and gloom. Even in some of the most, conservative and difficult countries when it comes to women's rights, we have seen some movement, women being able to enter the workforce. We have seen some changes, for example, where women don't need permission to be able to get a passport. And these are small wins, but they're indicative. But we do have to make sure that we're doing it both at the local level, at the national level, the regional level, and the global level.
So I would say you have hope for the future for women's rights.
I think women are very hard to stop. Yeah, the kafala system essentially ties migrant workers to their employers. And, in countries, particularly in the Gulf, where we have worked a lot on the kafala system, the governments rely on migrant workers to essentially, as a critical part of the workforce. But it's the conditions that migrant workers are working under and the restrictions under the kafala system. Because what that system sets up is an ability for employers to pay low wages or exploit their workers. There are very little rights. We have documented cases, obviously, where migrant workers arrive, they work incredibly long days, they're underpaid, they work under harsh conditions, they're forced to live in cramped, unsanitary conditions, their passports are taken away from them. In some of the most egregious cases, they're not even paid. So their salaries are actually withheld. And that's not just in the Gulf. That happens here in Lebanon too, particularly with domestic workers. And one of the failures of the system, besides its stripping migrant workers of their rights, is there's no legal redress. There's no way for migrant workers or domestic workers under the kafala system to be able to safely go and report, for example, that they're being exposed, there are labor rights violations or violence. I mean, we have seen cases in Lebanon where violence has been perpetrated against a domestic worker. They go to the police and they're sent back to their employer because their employer essentially is the person that the authorities decided is responsible for them. And in other cases where we've seen in Lebanon, where we've seen domestic workers who are trying to leave abusive situations where they haven't been paid or where they're experiencing violence, we've seen that the authorities, the employer has actually charged them with a fake charge of stealing, and then the authorities pursue them and they're jailed. I mean, these are, fundamentally these are labor rights violations, and these are fundamental workers' rights. We've seen the global labor rights movement mobilize, for example, against the well-documented abusive practices on the building of the Qatari football stadium for the recent World Cup. These are labor rights abuses, and there are international standards which governments must be held to account for. And if we take the Qatari example, one of the wins based using a labour rights framework was that they were able to implement protections to stop migrant workers from having to work in the hottest part of the day, because there were well-documented fatalities from people being out in such extreme heat, fainting, falling off building sites, and ultimately being injured or dying. But besides the labour rights issues, some of these issues, because the system is so skewed against the migrant worker or the domestic worker, and because the practices of the agencies who recruit them, sometimes telling them absolute lies about the conditions they'll be working in or how much they'll be paid, that actually doesn't become a labour rights issue. That can actually become a trafficking issue. And that is something, obviously, that there are many international legal standards and frameworks which governments have to address. Legal reform and labour rights is an important part of government standing in the world, including sometimes if you have human rights conditions on international assistance, labour rights and anti-trafficking are very important standards. Particularly, for example, there are certain governments, including the US government, that actually ranks that grades governments on their measures that they're taking to prevent anti-trafficking. So the consequences can be very significant if governments don't take the right steps to address these. The answer is in not just ensuring that you have laws that protect migrant workers and domestic workers, but it's also that those laws are implemented, and that there are also resource social services to be able to protect and serve migrant workers or domestic workers who may be fleeing abusive situations. So, the pathway is there. And legal reform is not hard. It is the duty and the obligation of the government to serve its citizens and people in its country and to protect them. And it is the responsibility of every state to live up to its international obligations. Human rights is not some sort of buffet that you walk along and you say, oh, I'd like to pick this one and I'd like a little bit of this one. These are agreements under law which are signed, and when governments violate them, they need to be held to account, whether that be at the international level or the domestic. The cultural relativism argument about human rights has been one that has been peddled for many years, saying this is a Western construct, this is an outside idea, this is not from our culture. I can guarantee you that Human Rights Watch works all over the world. And when we work with victims and survivors from Egypt to Libya to China, victims of torture, victims of serious abuses, they care about their human rights. Their families care about their human rights. You go to a mother of a disappeared person anywhere in the world, and they want justice and accountability. They want somebody to be responsible for the abuses that took place. Those are human rights. That's human rights in action. What we are seeing is that there is a global trend, and most certainly this region is embracing it, of an anti-human rights agenda, trying to marginalize human rights. But one of the things that we're seeing, and is not just an anti-human rights agenda, it's a slide to autocracy. And the first groups that we see governments who have autocratic tendencies go after are marginalized groups, going after women's rights, going after reproductive rights, and the LGBT community. These aren't just patterns. These should be a global wake-up call, because they are essentially the canary in the coal mine. This should be a giant flashing light when governments are going after marginalized communities like the LGBT community, like we're seeing here, and when they're going after free speech. Just recently in Jordan, we saw this cyber crime law come into action. That is essentially trying to curtail critics of the authorities and trying to silence freedom of expression, try to silence and shrink civic space. So when we see these actions, we should not be disheartened. This is exactly the time where civil society needs to rally, push back. We need to use the court systems domestically. We need to be raising international attention, and we need the international actors, the friends of the countries in the region, to be applying pressure, because if you want international standing, if you want that seat at the global international table, then you have to be a good faith actor who is willing to implement human rights and put the protection of your people first. Our finding of the crime of apartheid and persecution by the Israeli government was based on years of research. It's essentially, we have documented this overarching policy. It's not just one policy, it's an entire network and architecture of policies which are designed to essentially oppress the Palestinian people and ensure the domination of the Jewish Israeli population on the Palestinian people. And so this is not just about those frameworks and legislations, it's also about practices that also exist to reinforce and to implement that domination. And you see that every day in the daily lives of Palestinians, is what you were referring to, where Palestinians don't have the same freedom of movement. The people of Gaza cannot leave. Palestinians trying to move through the occupied territories are stopped at checkpoints. Their movements are restricted. And obviously we've seen other elements like land confiscation. But the range of abuses that we see perpetrated against the Palestinian people goes much further than even that. It's the day-to-day lives that they have. It's the violence that is perpetrated against them, where they have very little recourse by the security services, by other communities. But we also have seen that, they have limited access to electricity, to water, to basic services. So the case for the crime of apartheid has been made not only by Human Rights Watch, but by a number of Israeli and Palestinian organizations and other international organizations. So the facts are out there. They are not disputable. It is unfortunate that the conversation around apartheid is being shut down by the misuse of claims that criticism of the Israeli authorities around the crime of apartheid, or even the statement of the fact that the Israeli authorities are committing the crime of apartheid, is being labelled inaccurately as being anti-Semitic. These are facts. These are international crimes. The crime of apartheid is a crime against humanity. And we think about what can be done. I mean, there are obviously immediate legislative changes that can take place domestically within Israel, but because these are crimes against humanity, they can be tried at the International Criminal Court, and Human Rights Watch is in discussion with the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. But because the evidence is it's so clear, it has been documented by so many organizations now, it cannot be brushed away, and it needs to be part of the discussion going forward about the future of the conflict in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And it does actually show the illegitimacy of ensuring that the markers should be just around the peace process. The determination of apartheid lays out very clearly the facts and violations that are taking place, and any future peace and reconciliation in the territories will rely very much on concrete measures being taken by the Israeli authorities to dismantle this abusive system.
Right. No, that's perfect.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank you so much.
No, thank you. Really appreciate it.